Well, happy Indigenous Solidarity Day. We'll go into what that's all about just a little bit. Let's see if the machines are working. Ah, they are. Okay, so housekeeping. Until this year, I really didn't use a Moodle gradebook, and I'm still learning because we just did an upgrade. So basically, I, like lots of folks, essentially kept an Excel spreadsheet on our own machines, which wouldn't be exported to Moodle. Maybe that's changed. Maybe the gradebook has gotten better, but you have to program the gradebook. So those of you, basically 30 points is full credit, no matter what the gradebook says, because I haven't programmed the gradebook to reflect reality. So what happens, those of you... Antenna, no signal, except audio.
We can hear you through the ceiling mic.
Oh, right, yes.
Okay.
Somewhat attenuated, yeah. All right, so the idea is that 30 points is full credit. So far you've had a maximum of 60 with extra credit and the reaction paper. So even if the gradebook program says you got an F, that ain't true, because it can't grade what hasn't come in yet, and I haven't programmed it to reflect that because that was a new thing that just got added, and I'll be going to class to learn how to do that myself. So, can't take into account what hasn't been presented yet. So you don't have an F. Don't trip. Just turn your stuff in. All right? So, happy Indigenous Solidarity Day. I asked the late, great historian Howard Zinn at the U of O last time he was here, what is the best thing you can say about Columbus? Because he really ripped into Columbus on Columbus Day, which we've renamed Indigenous Solidarity Day. And he said that there's been, the best thing you can say about Columbus, which isn't even really about Columbus, that there's been 500 years of resistance to colonization. Okay. So, according to Natives Count, there were 150 million people on Turtle Island before 1492. So, for example, trade and exploration had been going on with Africa, Asia, and Europe before there was a concept of a united Europe. And there wasn't a concept of a united Europe till really after the Dark Ages. In the time of the Romans, if those of you who construct a reality based on Hollywood movies, Gladiator with, what's his face, Russell Crowe. Okay, the attitude of the Romans towards the Germans, you're barbarians. No writing, you dress in animal skins, you don't know how to fight. Who are you? Because they lived in cities and the Germans lived in, the forest. And that was their attitude. We're the ones who are civilized, you were savages. And that was their point of view, right? There was no united Europe until they basically tried to unite, and nobody actually really did that until more or less the modern times, right? Jack Forbes, in his book, The American Discovery of Europe, talks about native exploration into Europe, and that's an interesting book if you want to pick it up or get it from the library. So there wasn't a concept of a united Europe. So the process of reducing the population of at least 50 million Native Americans in what we call North America to 3 or 4 million a day is kind of the equivalent of one 9/11 every day for 54 years. This was basically a piece that I wrote because people were talking about, establishing the whole mosque thing near ground zero. That's a victory dance for Islam. Like, stop. The pot can't call the kettle black. Really. All right? That's like one 9/11 every day for 54 years. And if you use the figures that Native Americans agree on, so 150 million, that is for North 50 million, Central 40 million, and South America then that's one 9/11 every day for 137 years over that 500-year period. So if we talked last week about religious privilege, erecting the Pentagon, Mount Rushmore, and Stone Mountain on Native American sacred sites looks like a Christian victory dance to me. And I don't think carving dead white guys on an otherwise pristine mountain improves the view, especially if you think of Creator making mountains in a particular way. Let the mountain and the natural beauty stay. Building Wall Street on the graves of African slaves is also a desecration. Now, we don't really talk about it, but we do talk about it in this class. So, in fact, the Wall of Wall Street was built by African slaves and European indentured servants to keep out native nations. That's what it was there for. You know, along that lower part of the island, and basically the native nations themselves didn't believe in real estate, or that is ownership of land, private ownership of land, having poor people, let alone racism, sexism, or religious intolerance, not to mention not believing in drunkenness, domestic violence, that is wife abuse or child abuse, either. So when we talk about Tulip, Wapakisinap, the long-reaching land, Turtle Island, talking about thousands of years of history and complex, at least hundreds of years of complex urban civilization. So Tulip Wapakisinap is in one language basically translated as the long-reaching land, indigenous name for North, Central, and South America. Also known in Al-Kabulon, Africa by other names, Atalanta, water metal, and the circuit of the world. That is the only land that stretches from the North Pole to the South Pole, unbroken. So the long-reaching land, or the circuit of the world. So there were not necessarily military alliances, but trade alliances between those two continents that we'll be looking at, primarily the one that we're on, and Al-Kabulon, that predate Western civilization. So trade in genes, technology, art, and spirituality. So trade, not colonization. So when we talk about America as land of the free and Africa as the dark continent, who's telling that tale? And why is it known as the dark continent? When it could be, you know, from the historical record being clear that, if you did the reading, right? Asante makes a case for this being the cradle of civilization, depending on what you mean by civilization. So even though Columbus knew that Taino had contacts with Africans, that information is left out of the narrative of Western civilization. So this is an example, for example, of what natives have started to do to correct the record. So we're just looking at northern Turtle Island now from basically Mexico and the Mayan all the way up to the Arctic Circle. These are the trade routes that existed. So in order to basically even have a trade route, you basically have to live beyond a subsistence level. And since there's no interstate then, right, you still have to be able to trade whatever trade goods you have. So for example, on the West Coast where we have abalone, you can trade, and there was trade with tribes of the Southwest with turquoise straight across. Now we might not think that that's a fair trade, but they're going on, look, it's difficult to get. You might, if you go to a powwow, you'll see natives wearing strings of dentalium shell. Well, dentalium shell is, you have to get it 60 feet deep. So there's degrees of difficulty. I mean, if you're gonna die for abalone is like usually 30 feet deep too. You don't necessarily find a shell just walking down the beach. You actually have to dive for it, right? Same with dentalium. So there's degrees of difficulty with a trade item for that you figure into the value. Another representation of trade routes. This is Tenochtitlan, which is a city built on an artificial island on an artificial lake. Pyramid city. This is an overhead view, artist's conception. This is another artist's conception. So streams and rivers that flood into the valley. This is near what's now Mexico City. Another artist's conception of city. So it's along islands. So you have there's a book by Stenard that basically talks about Cortez, quoting Cortez when he first comes to the city, and he's describing what's there. And so there are canoes and separate streets in the great marketplace, in addition to what's going on, that it's a pyramid city, but he's talking about, in the market you have separate streets for building materials, so one for bricks, one for wood, one for ceramic tile, separate street for chicken, are they live chicken, are they cooked chicken, separate street for deer, fish, etc., etc., etc. He said, and there's nothing like this in Europe. Right, nothing like that. Streets are swept clean every day, and they were amazed because they'd never seen anything like that. And the classic Mayan calendar, also 365 days. So, who civilized who? What kind of civilization existed here before civilization was brought here? How do you make humans more civilized is a question. You could learn them young and systematically, and you don't have to depend on a state to do it. Even though today in our society, outside of charter schools, public education is a state function, is a function of the state. So since we're considering, and I was considering in terms of looking at how do I illuminate what Asante isn't necessarily talking about, though he is kind of hitting the high points. How do you get a state to emerge and generate Egypt? So from the same source that I got, the African Constitution Bill of Rights, Chancellor Williams in his book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, kind of outlines what I call original old school rites of passage. So for those of you who are not familiar with rites of passage, what they are, there's 4 basic ones. So rites of passage is basically the Western etic anthropological term for these things. So there are 4 basic ones occurring at birth, puberty, marriage, and death. And these are basically within many human societies that are what we would refer to from our bias pre-technological. That is where we think machine-based technology is, the epitome of being civilized. So Kemet and other societies would basically add afterlife and rebirth as a rite of passage as well. So the basic idea is that critical life transition periods are ritualized, involving tests of skill, courage, spirituality, and ingenuity. Usually there's an element of life, death, danger within them, or an implication of life and death consideration. So for example, among, say, the Zulu, you have to, if you're a male child at puberty, got to kill a lion with a spear. The Australian Aborigines used to have walkabouts, where actually there was a movie called Walkabout, where this guy on his walkabout, basically you walk into the bush and you survive alone for a year. If you come back, you're an adult, functionally. So various other societies had rites of passage as well. Here at Lane, 17 years ago, we had We created a rites of passage program that's still going, basically for youth of color, and white youth that want to hang with youth of color, that are in some kind of relationship, usually adopted or something like that. But so basically, rites of passage are designed to give you a place in society to maintain and grow that society. So they're lifelong and community-wide. So again, the four basic ones could be, obviously a lifespan, birth, puberty, marriage, death, but there could be other ones, other celebrations as well, lifelong and community-wide. So ingrained within the DNA code are in rites of passage that in the absence of formal rites of passage, people initiate themselves. In fact, anthropologists have seen this. For example, where indigenous or cultures of tradition, and by that I mean before Western civilization, they're still maintaining their traditional ways that go back thousands of years. When they give up their rites of passage under the pressure to become westernized, their youth begin doing gang behavior. We see that actually in Papua New Guinea, New Zealand, et cetera, where people basically adopt certain Western ways and abandon their traditional ways, start getting into alcohol and drug use, getting into violence, gun violence, et cetera, and as soon as they stop doing the rites of passage, and then they've been reinitiating and recreating rites of passage, and the gang activity stops. So we've actually at Lane been using that as an intervention as well, where we actually started it. Well, I can use my academic freedom we actually started because the local youth service department was not being responsive to communities of color, particularly not giving services. And one of the things, when you're in a state that made black people illegal to be in the state, what's the county going to be like? County's going to follow suit. So they're not necessarily going to have services. So 17 years we've served, just in the African American youth, 600 kids. 3 of them have gone to jail. More than half of them have gone on to college or the military or in employment. 3 have gone to jail out of 600. Let's see Serbu's record on that. Oh, they won't give you the record. You ask for the information, they don't give it to you. That's just as damning, I'd say. So, according to Williams, in the destruction of black civilization and chiefless societies in Alkebulan before the rise of city-states, starting 5,000 years ago, that is when city-states started, using Kemet as the example, before the creation of the pyramids, the rise of Nubia, Kush, Ethiopia, Israel, Carthage, Songhai, Mali, Zimbabwe, and countless other societies. So Asante talks about the first Pharaoh, or by his Hebrew name, Pharaoh of Kemet, united 42 different ethnic groups to create Egypt by conquest, right? So that's just in that area of Africa. And remember, Africa is a continent with 1,800 languages today. So imagine what that would have been 5,000 years ago, easily that many, if not more. So a common system of education, governance, economics was devised, making the creation of city-states possible. With tribal variations, a set of fundamental rights, as well as constitution was created, which you've already seen, rested on home training. And the following is the minimum home training given. So Williams calls this age grade, age set. So it goes by calendar age. So obviously, you have to have a calendar first. You also have a system of numbering first before you can develop this, and language, of course. Plus a whole other host of things that will become obvious when you look at what's coming. So the education from 0 to 12. which he calls age grade A. So starting at age 6 or 7. Now remember, this is happening without a state. Okay? Happening without a state and also without formal schools. So generated by essentially the family. So storytelling, mental arithmetic with counting games, musical accompaniment, singing, basic percussion, community songs and dances, biology and ecology, botany, that is useful and dangerous plants, herpetology, poisonous reptiles, always a useful skill when you have like 13 of the most dangerous poisonous snakes on the planet, oratory and debate, gardening, animal husbandry, cooking, sewing, community relations. All those you were your age, you were literally your brothers and sisters. So let's see, if we use the common calculation for figuring, okay, 12 minus, say, 5 or 6, age puts you in about 5th or 6th grade here. So did you have biology and ecology in 6th grade? Okay, so remember, this is being done without public schools. This is basically tribally, family-based education before city-states. And you can see why you want a little kid. You know, I mean, those of you who are parents know that there's a certain stage, especially when they're crawling, where they basically, you know, eat off the floor, anything that looks randomly interesting. So you might not want to do that outside where there's, you know, poisonous snakes, plants, etc. around. You have to constantly watch them.